Welcome to Module 3 in our Graphic Medicine lecture series. I'm Dr. Rachel Thomas. Hopefully, you've been able to start to think of a short story based on a personal experience that you can explore through a comic. Today, we're going to focus on some literary theory to start to get you to think in terms of visual storytelling. It's going to involve some short exercises to get you to think about how you might structure images and text in your final comic. I'd like to acknowledge that funding for this set of modules comes from the HEAL Healthcare Project via the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. The Hearts-Based Education and Anti-Colonial Learning Project, or HEAL, is funded in part by Indigenous Services Canada. As much of this research and creation was conducted on Quebecois soil, I would like to take the time to recognize that I acknowledge that my work in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, takes place on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk Nation. We're going to start off with semiotic theory, specifically Roland Barthes' theory of sign and signifier. Now don't worry, it sounds complicated, but I'm going to break it down for you because, in all honesty, we use sign and signifier all day, every day, and aren't even aware of it. This lecture might make you hyper aware of it though, just like how film students sometimes find it hard to watch movies because they're fully aware of the theory behind it all. It's going to help you better interpret comics and ultimately will help you make better comics. Roland Barthes was a French literary theorist and philosopher who made profound insights into the study of signs and language. His book, Image, Music, Text, is a collection of essays that dive into this. In this book, Barthes explores various aspects of semiotics and cultural analysis. Barthes examines the power of visual images, particularly in photography and film. He discusses how images can convey multiple meanings and interpretations influenced by cultural, historical, and personal contexts. Now, when it comes to sign and signifier and how it relates to visual images, Barthes' theory highlights the idea that language and signs are constructed and their meanings are not fixed, but subject to interpretation and cultural context. So what are sign, signifier, and signified, and how does this impact how we make comics? Well, it shapes how we read comics, so we as authors and artists have to know how our images and text are going to speak to our readers. What a sign is composed of two parts: the signifier, which is the physical form or representation of the sign, such as a word, image, or sound, and signified. This is the concept or meaning associated with the signifier. As an example, this is a more or less universal image of men and women, and when we see it, we know that it means bathroom. The signifier is this specific image, and what it signifies is washroom. Barthes emphasizes that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. In other words, there is no inherent connection between the physical form, or signifier, and the meaning, signified. This relationship is established by society and culture through conventions and shared understandings. The idea of universality comes into play here. That's why we have systems of symbols to help us understand where things are when we don't speak the language. Barthes believes that these sign systems are essential in shaping our perception of reality. The image, or signifier, and what it means, signified, can tell us everything we need to know without even using language. So in applying this to comics, the signifier is the image used to stand for something else, while the signified is what it stands for, either a real thing or, in a stricter reading, a sense impression. A basic example, the speech bubble. The speech bubble's form, the signifier, signifies the communication happening within the comic, and its content, signified, represents the character's spoken words or inner thoughts. The other fun thing about signs, signifiers, and signified is that there are multiple ways that a signified, or meaning, can be expressed by different images, objects, or language, and fundamentally, one isn't better than another. Barthes also argued from an anti-essentialist perspective, in that he was strongly opposed to the idea that there is anything contained in a particular signifier, the thing, that makes it correspond better or worse to its signified, the meaning. How it's ultimately divided has to do with social construction and cultural relativity. Our categories of language will determine how we as humans will break up objects into types and meanings, and our signs will depend on the system of signs that already exist. In fact, they won't have any meaning at all unless they're working under this umbrella. Color is a great example of this. Generally, in Western cultures like Canada, we associate the color red with danger or caution, anger, and generally negative emotions. In contrast, in Chinese culture, red is associated with joy and good luck, which is why it's used in imagery for New Year's. The same colors, but they're vastly different meanings. Cultural relativity is huge when it comes to signs and signifiers. Now that was a lot of theory to throw at you in a short period of time, but there's a reason. You need to be aware of what images you're using in your comics and what they will signify to your reader. This is the fundamental process of meaning making in reading a comic, and it is quintessential in driving not only the narrative, but what your reader will take away from the experience. The division into categories is always a process of social construction. People don't start off with thoughts or perceptions of objects, which they then express in language. The categories of language determine how people divide up objects into types. Furthermore, all signs depend on the entire system of signs. None of them have meaning aside from this system. So what could this look like in a comic? Well, comics employ metaphor, which is a form of sign, signifier, signified, a lot as a literary tool. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. It involves expressing an idea or conveying meaning by suggesting a resemblance or analogy between two different things. Metaphors play a significant role in comics and other forms of creative writing, allowing writers to convey complex emotions, ideas, and images in a vivid and imaginative way. They add depth and nuance to our visual language. It highlights the creative and dynamic nature of human thought as we use metaphor to make sense of abstract concepts through connections with more tangible experiences. This will let us connect better with our readers on an emotional level. So in a metaphor, much like sign, signifier, signified, we have a source domain, which is the original idea, and the target domain, which is the concept. Metaphor is how we connect those two. This signifies that. Now there are plenty of ways to incorporate this into comics, and you should start thinking about how these might apply to your own. There are things like visual metaphors. Visual elements in comics, such as images, symbols, and artistic styles, can serve as metaphors. For example, a character's physical appearance, costume, or surroundings might metaphorically represent their personality, struggles, or role in the story. This is Art Spiegelman's mouse. You've probably heard this before, but Spiegelman uses what's called anthropomorphism, meaning representing humans as animals, to discuss real-world issues in a meaningful way. He depicts cats as Nazis and the mice as Jewish people, relating to power struggles, terror, and extermination by the Aryan race, or the better race, things that really did happen during the Holocaust, but made into a metaphor of the relationships between two animals. You can also consider panel composition. The arrangement of panels on a comic page can be metaphorical. The size, placement, and sequence of panels can convey a sense of time, urgency, or emotional intensity, adding layers of meaning to the narrative. This is an excerpt from Shrink. I'm using smoke to push and pull the action from side to side, lining up with what's going on in the narrative. It's scary, adrenaline pumping, and all of a sudden it makes the reader full stop by eliminating everything save for a few words. It's metaphor for this sense of emotional whiplash that happens in the action. We also use symbolic imagery. Symbols and recurring visual motifs in comics often function as metaphors. These symbols may represent broader concepts, cultural references, or character traits. The repetition of certain images reinforces their metaphorical significance. This panel is from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. There are also visual metaphors for abstract concepts. Comics often find creative ways to visually represent abstract concepts or emotions. This can include using metaphorical imagery to depict dreams, memories, or psychological states. One of the most incredible things in art is artists are able to depict things through images where words fail. And sometimes those things are much more relatable and impact us far greater than a literary explanation. There's a concept in Spanish that's specifically related to art, duende, which is the recognition of the mysterious power of an art form to elicit an emotional response and connect with the viewer in a very deep way. You have the power to do that by combining image and text through your comics. I'd like you to do a short exercise. I want you to have a look at the emotions I've provided on the screen and take 10 minutes to think of how you could metaphorically represent that emotion in a way that many people will understand. To reiterate, when you're working with metaphor or sign, signifier, signified, you have to think in both universal and culturally relative terms. Think about who your demographic is, who will be seeing this, from which culture, and will they be able to understand the meaning that you're driving using the image and text? Do you think you came up with a good example of how to represent your emotion? Disney is great at doing this. This panel is from Inside Out, where they literally had to attach images to an emotion. This one is anger. We understand it immediately using our Western symbolic order. They used fire and red to denote anger, frustration. We've spoken about sign and signifier now, so it's important to talk about how this works within visual storytelling. Like we learned in Module 1, humans have been illustrating since the beginning of our history. Even cavemen used narrative sequencing using images to talk about experiences of hunting or animals encountered in a simplistic and understandable way that didn't require any explanation. You know what the thing is, and you know what that thing stands for. Storytelling became integral to our development as human beings. Signs and symbols exist everywhere. We have universal images and icons that tell us exactly what they mean. For instance, the toilet symbol or any symbols for food. Emojis have this power as well. We recognize the crying emoji is sadness, meaning that we've been able to search out the story or the signifier the image stands for. Comics take small compositions within panels or cells put together to create a sequence that then tells a story. Sometimes there are multiple cells, and sometimes it's just one. What they have in common is they tell stories. Let's start with the basics. I want you to think about the narrative you've been developing, and I want you to succinctly write out the following. Start with plot. We start with this as it establishes the events of the story in sequence. Think about setting, the time, place, and overall mood, and what this could look like. The characters. Who are they? What makes them unique? Who are your characters? Let's talk about your main character of your comic. You have to know everything about your character, their history, desires, strengths, weaknesses, and the theme you're addressing using them. Are you referencing someone that exists in real life? Ostensibly, you'll more likely be using yourself as a point of reference. Think about the most interesting aspects of your character. Do they have piercings, a certain haircut, birthmarks, a weird body size or shape? These are all things to consider. It's important to think about how our narrative will develop over time. A narrative arc starts with an exposition, which is the introduction to and context around our story and characters. There is then an inciting incident, which is the beginning of the climax period. The climax, where all points converge, is typically the highest action point of the story. It's followed by the denouement, or a conclusion. Loose ends are tied up and we conclude. You may think that these story arcs don't exist in 4-panel comics, but the gift of a good comic artist is to do it in a few words or images or less. Going off of what I said about 4-panel comics, this is an excellent one from Puddle Munch. Panel 1 is the setup. We get context, who the main character is, and the setting. This doesn't necessarily need to be done in words, and in fact can be done very easily just using images. We can see that the context is a caveman trying to make fire and having a hard time. Panel 2 is the rising action, what's leading to the climax. He's hyping himself up and he's trying to make fire. Panel 3 is the climax, or, in a lot of funny comics, the gag. He makes fire. Panel 4 is the denouement, or falling action, the aftermath of the gag that lets us contextualize what we've seen and understand it as being funny. His family is wondering why a grown man in contemporary times is trying to make fire like a caveman. Now, there are a lot of hilarious things you can do with this, like not providing the full context to the reader to begin with, which is why it's so funny, the old bait and switch. We think we're seeing something as it is, but in reality, it's not. The next thing to consider is point of view. Is it first person or third person narrative? Is it coming from I, or is it coming from he, she, they? Is this consistent, or is it a mix between the two, i.e., having a narrator also explaining to the reader what's going on in a character's life while the character lives it. Last is theme. What are you trying to fundamentally address in your story? Is it an emotion you're trying to demonstrate? Is it a traumatic experience? An experience that taught you a lesson? This work is talking directly about the character coming in for painkillers and a doctor accusing them of drug-seeking behavior. That's surface level. Fundamentally, it's addressing a more serious issue: medical stigma against patients who require access to these medications. And the character is also a woman of color, which adds further to the biases. Now, using this information, we're going to develop a very basic layout of what our comic will look like. I encourage you to try a basic 4-panel comic, but at your discretion, because this can obviously be longer. Grab yourself a piece of printer paper or whatever you have on hand. I've fully drawn on napkins before, and a pencil. These sketches do not need to look pretty. They're what are called thumbnail sketches, and it helps us plan out where characters will exist in space, in relation to each other, where the text bubbles might go, etc. You need to see whether the content you want is going to fit within each cell, whether the story moves forward properly. Does the dialogue work? Is the action clear? Is there too much or not enough happening on each page? Is there too much text or too little? If you find problems in your first round of thumbnails, simply toss it out and create a new sketch. This part of the creative process can involve a lot of trial and error, and that's okay. It's always better to figure out how the story progresses before you spend time inking and coloring your comic book drawings. The more you draw, the better you'll get at determining how to sequence your panels and when to make cuts. For now, if you're just starting out in the world of comic book creation, stick to simple layouts. Leave the complicated compositions for a future project when you've acquired more skills. My sketches are hideous, but I do them quickly to figure out how to lay out my cells and make sure I'm happy with them before I even start to finalize drawings. It's an important step. Once you're happy with your layout, set it aside. We're going to chat about character design. Now we're going to focus on character design. Hopefully, you've written out some qualities about your character, and it's now time to put them into action. Write these qualities out and make sure you're consistent when you're first starting to develop your sketches. We're going to go into some more fun with characters, but for the moment, we're going to start with basic proportions. Now, if you've been in medical school or anything adjacent, you'll probably be well prepared for this section. However, I'm going to talk about proportion in terms of constructing bodies through drawing, so it is going to be a little bit different. We are going to be drawing this body on the coronal plane. I've included a grid in your workbook, but make sure you leave space for the profile view if you're going to practice. You'll notice in the upcoming slides that I've centered the body in the direct center of the grid. Try as much as possible to keep it to one side or the other, so that there is extra space for your profile view. I'd like you to follow along with me, so I've added extra time for each slide so that you won't have to pause the video. However, if you're finding that you need to erase lines, please do pause the video and do so. To begin with, the standard human form is about 8 heads high. I've taken the liberty of providing a grid in your workbook to start this out. Begin by drawing an oval shape for the head in the first box. Make sure you keep this head towards the left-hand side so that you are able to fill in your profile view. I've taken the liberty of having this straight in the center to make it easier to see. Next is your pelvis. That will be a circle that sits in box 3. But instead of a circle, it's sort of an oblong shape, and you can put in 2 little round circles for where the femur connects into your acetabulum. Add a line to connect your head to your pelvis as your spine. Congratulations, you have your trunk. Next are your legs. Poses will change, but for the purposes of this module, our character is going to be facing forward. You can draw your patellas on mark 6 and your feet circles on mark 8. Now we know legs aren't perfectly straight lines. Where the head of the femur connects with the pelvis faces inwards, compared with the knee connecting to the ankle. So put a couple of lines connecting the head of the femur to the inside of the patella and the patella circles to the feet circles on the outside. Now we can put in our rib cage. The rib cage is going to start halfway between mark 1 and end somewhere in between 2 to 3. Draw an oval and then cut the bottom off to make a rib cage. Don't connect your rib cage and hips together either. These are 2 separately moving areas of the body and have different ranges of motions. Also, as an aside, your nipples typically align with your ears. Yes, I made it weird. Your shoulders will start at the top of the oval you've created for your ribs and will be about 2 to 3 heads in width. Now this can vary enormously depending on how much the trapezius is developed, but this is a good starting point. Put 2 circles to indicate where the humeral head connects to the glenoid. Your wrists are going to fall on mark 4, just slightly below your hips. The hands will extend just below to just above halfway up the thigh. You can just draw elongated ovals for hands and throw some thumbs in there if you want. On this plane, your thumbs will be facing your hips. If you haven't done so already, connect everything with lines, and there you go. Very basic and accurate human anatomy. To start adding volume to your bodies, think of everything like a tube. I mean, we are fundamentally tubes, a mouth to anus, but also more generally in how bodies are shaped. Your tube arms are going to go big to small from the top of the humerus to the elbow, then big to small again from the elbow to the wrist. The legs are the same, big at the hip to small at the knee, to big from below the knee to small at the ankle. Your neck is a tube that starts small and goes to big at the shoulders. Connect all of your tubes and you've got a filled out body. Now this is super basic anatomy, but once you've gotten the hang of it, you can start playing around with purposely messing up that anatomy in your comics. Making legs longer, making heads bigger, these are all allowed, provided you're following a really basic understanding of anatomy. This panel is from Spider-Woman, issue 15 from 1999. The proportions are correct, but it's not what we would see in real life. This can give us a sense of strength, clearly indicating the hero. These are sometimes problematic because they're still based on a very white, idealized body that we are constantly influenced by media-wise. So it's really great to see bodies that don't fit this. I'm only using this as an example because it's so extreme in terms of the proportional changes. Now we're going to focus on the human body in profile. We'll use the right-hand side of the same grid from the workbook. The first step is to establish your head and pelvis in the same sections, with your head being slightly oblong to accommodate the back of the skull. Your spine is a sort of flattened S shape, which begins just off center of your head and then goes down past the farthest part of your shoulders. Remember, your shoulders are slightly curved inwards, but you wouldn't be able to see that from this angle. And so, the spine doesn't go straight down. It curves slightly inwards under the ribs and then flares back out when you hit the pelvis, aka your coccyx. You can also put in the markings for your patellas and your ankles. From here, you can plot out your rib cage. When a human is standing upright, generally speaking, your ribs flare out slightly. Your pelvis is ahead of the vertical axis and counterbalanced by your ankle. So in terms of weight distribution, we will have a slightly curved line that accounts for the center of gravity and balance when standing up straight. Your ribs are going to be a basic oblong circle falling between lines 1 and 2 and mashed up against the middle part of the spine. Your patella will sit again at line 6. Now your hip joint sits ahead of your knee joint, and the knee joint sits behind the ankle joint. Your shoulder circle will fall centrally in between lines 1 and 2, and for the most part, your humerus is a straight line downwards, with your elbow sitting just above line 3. Your radius and ulna will fall between 3 and 4, with your wrist joint falling on line number 4. At rest, we don't generally straighten our arms out completely, so having your arm bent slightly will make it look more natural. This is the same for your fingers. Typically, they'll be slightly bent. Now using these lines, you can start to add volume. Again, bodies are mostly made of tubes. Hands and feet are a point of contention for people, so drawing them in mitten style can help. Think about what you're really looking at in terms of basic shapes. Take a look at your own hand. In a basic sense, your fingers form one shape and your palm another. Your thumb is another shape completely. Draw these shapes out. Even when the fingers are spread out, there is a fan shape that emerges. Draw the fan shape. It's very basic, but you can now split these up evenly to form fingers, which are, again, composed of squared off tubes. Think of your feet in the same way. From the side, your foot is mostly flat on the bottom. Your toes make up a little lump at the front, and then it's basically a triangle on its side. From the front, it's basically two triangles stacked, one for your foreshortened toes and one to make up your ankle. This takes practice. Draw lots of little hands and feet everywhere you can. Look at your own hands, draw them from different angles, and draw your feet. Don't make it weird. Switch to the next page of your workbook, and we're going to do a quick tutorial on how to construct a face. Start with an oblong egg shape. It should be slightly larger at the top. Divide your head in half vertically and horizontally. Divide the bottom half of your face horizontally once again. The point where the vertical line meets the bottom horizontal line marks the bottom of the nose. Draw in your nostrils. These can be two half circle shapes and can be really basic. Divide the lower half of the face again by adding another horizontal line. This is where the mouth will go. More specifically, the bottom lip will rest above the bottom line. On top of your horizontal line, add two oblong circles to represent your eye sockets and, subsequently, the top of your cheekbones. These should be fairly circular and not eye-shaped. Your eyebrows will go at the top of your eye sockets. Now we're going to have a neutral expression here, but don't discount the fact that your facial expressions can be much improved with where you put your eyebrows. Surprise, anger, furrowed brows, it's all important. That's something to tuck away for later when you're playing with character design. The eyes will sit centered inside the eye sockets, and they're generally oblong almond shapes. Obviously, different races will have different sizes of eyes and different depths to which they sit inside the skull, as well as different eyelids. so make sure you play around with that. A good rule of thumb is to draw a central eye to measure the distance between the two, as most eyes are about one eye width apart. There are exceptions, of course, but typically this is the distance. Your irises will be basic circles that sit inside your eye, and your pupil sits inside of that. This example will have the eyes facing forward, but try to play with which direction the eyes are looking to create a sense of emotion. Also make sure when you're doing that you take into consideration your eyelids. When looking up, your upper lid will be less pronounced than if you're looking straight ahead. My advice? Look at photos and study the eyes. In this example, the eyelids will sit ever so slightly over your irises and pupils. Race will determine whether a person has hooded eyes, meaning more eyelids showing, or more open. You can play around with this as you like. Generally speaking, your ears will fall on the outside of the head, between the space of your eyes and your mouth. Basic shapes are more than enough, and you don't need to go into too much detail. So that is your very basic face. You can then add a neck, which coronally connects your ears down to your shoulders. You can also add hair, as you like. Again, once you can do basic proportions is when you can start playing around with them. Think about your main character. Would they work with exaggerated features like giant ears or eyes? How might that speak to your viewer, and what does it tell us about the character if you do so? Caricature artists are amazing examples of how you can stretch proportions in a funny or meaningful way. The great thing about comics is that you don't have to be a realistic artist. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Many of the best comics and cartoon artists have their own unique twist on proportions. The only thing you need to keep in mind is to stay consistent. In the next module, we are going to do some quick drawing exercises to get you going, but the biggest takeaway I can offer is that you need to practice. Practice, practice, practice. Some of us have a sort of innate understanding of anatomy. I'm not one of them. I've had to practice a lot to be able to draw. Have a look at different bodies too. Male and females will have different shaped pelvises, for instance. They'll have different upper bodies as well. Fatter bodies will be shaped differently, and children are shaped different still. My advice? Look at photos of different bodies and apply these rules to try to draw them. Practice from photos, especially for things like foreshortening. Sometimes our brains want to process what we know from anatomy, which ends up giving us funny-looking proportions. When in doubt, go back to the tubes. And remember, tubes look different when they're facing us head on. Now you can use this basic form to start to develop your own character using the description you created. This is going to give you a good starting point for the next module where we can talk about posing. If you're struggling to start, think back to your narrative. Who is your main character? It's good to start there. Take your character and think, how can we show how they contribute to the narrative we want? If you're struggling still, start with their attributes. Not just what they look like, but also how do they act? For our fourth and final module, I want you to have a final basic sketch for your 4-panel comic. The emphasis here is on basic. It can even be stick figures. My mom, for instance, doesn't know how to draw, but has great ideas and loves drawing stick figures. You can even keep your final comic as stick figures. It sometimes works. Think about your setting, the mood, and the character themselves. Are the characters speaking to each other through speech bubbles? How are they interacting? What do they even look like? Hair, their face? Are they even human? Are they anthropomorphized animals? Animals with human attributes, like Spiegelman's mouse? This will help us work on the final comic. Do basic line work to begin with, really sketchy, and do it multiple times. Keep drawing, because only over doing this multiple times do we get better. You can always use a piece of vellum paper over the top of a sketch you'd like to copy, and then use it in your final work. You can also trace directly over the sketch with ink and erase the underlines once the ink is dry. We are coming to the end of Module 3. Thank you so much for participating, and I'll see you in Module 4.